Hello, I'm Mr. Heaton, the art teacher here at David Urey Elementary, and I am so excited to read to you today. Now, I want to set some ground rules as I'm the very first reader in our journey together. The book we're all reading together should be Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar. I want to bring up a few little details. I'm not going to be the only reader. Two other teachers have volunteered to read alongside me. That'll be Miss Clemens, your music teacher, and Miss Morgan, the librarian. Some things you need to keep in mind. This book is a collection of short stories. And what that means is not each chapter necessarily connects. So each one is its own unique little story. So we won't actually be reading all of the chapters to you. We'll be reading many of them to you, but not all 30. So please do keep that in mind. So when you listen to our videos, we'll begin by telling you what chapter and what page number you need to listen for. So please, please, please do listen throughout the video, but make sure you hear what chapter and what page number we're turning to as we are starting a new story each day. Now, since this is the first video, it only seems appropriate to start with the introduction and the very first chapter, Mrs. Gorf. Now, before we get to Miss Gorf, let's get to that introduction. Now, the weird thing about the introduction, there isn't a page number. So if you'll just go just past the table of contents, you'll find in big bold letters right there, introduction. Please do turn to that page now, and I'll begin. You there? Excellent. Let's begin. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there are some things you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be only one story high, with 30 classrooms all in a row. Instead, it is 30 stories high, with one classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 13th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly. That is probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. And that probably also is true. Now, if you'll go ahead and turn to page 1, we'll begin the tale of Miss Gorf. Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher at Wayside School. She taught the class on the 13th story. If you children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears and stick out my tongue and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add, he couldn't even count, but he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. Oh. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Miss Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, and then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. Does anybody else have an opinion? She asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed 3 apples on her desk. Stefan started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I don't allow crying in my classroom, said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stefan into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they all went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stefan couldn't go home. Miss Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Miss Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, God bless you. When Paul sneezed, Miss Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Torrance fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia turned to run away. She was halfway to the door as Miss Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gore's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Miss Gorf stuck out her tongue. Mauricia became an apple. Miss Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Miss Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The three Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Miss Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stefan, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Mauricia, and the other three Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher. So he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. Oh no. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Lewis, the yard teacher, came back into the classroom. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples. Miss Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up to 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Miss Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Miss Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into apple sauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Miss Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Miss Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, then her right, and turned the apples back into children. All right, said Mauricia. Let's go get Lewis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Ginny held up a mirror, and Miss Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, am I hungry, said Lewis.
I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it on his shirt, and ate it. What a wild beginning to this story. I was really worried for those kids there. Just for a hot minute there, it was looking pretty bad. Well, I hope you enjoyed this story. And if you click in the next link, you'll see the next video in this collection. I hope you enjoy that chapter just as much as I enjoyed watching Miss Gorf turn those children into apples. I hope you have a wonderful night, and I hope you enjoyed this story. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Hi everyone, this is Miss Clements. Today we are going to be reading chapter 3, starting on page 12, and this is the chapter called Joe. Joe had curly hair, but he didn't know how much hair he had. He couldn't count that high. In fact, he couldn't count at all. When all of the other children went to recess, Miss Jules told Joe to wait inside. "Joe," she said, "how much hair do you have?" Joe shrugged his shoulders. "A lot," he answered. "But how much, Joe?" asked Miss Jules. "Enough to cover my head," Joe answered. "Joe, you're going to have to learn how to count," said Miss Jules. "But, Miss Jules, I already know how to count," said Joe. "Let me go to recess." "First count to 10, said Miss Jules. Joe counted to 10. 6, 8, 12, 1, 5, 2, 7, 11, 3, 10. "No, Joe, that is wrong," said Miss Jules. "No, it isn't," said Joe. "I counted until I got to 10. "But you were wrong," said Miss Jules. "I'll prove it to you." She put 5 pencils on his desk. "How many pencils do we have here, Joe?" Joe counted the pencils. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "There are 5 pencils, Miss Jules." "That's wrong," said Mrs. Jules. "How many pencils are there?" Joe asked. 5, said Miss Jules. "That's what I said," said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No," said Miss Jules. "You got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way. You were just lucky." She set 8 potatoes on his desk. "How many potatoes, Joe?" Joe counted the potatoes. 7, 5, 3, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8. "There are 8 potatoes, Miss Jules." "No, there are 8, said Miss Jules. "But that's what I said," said Joe. "May I go to recess now?" "No, you got the right answer, but you counted the wrong way again." She put 3 books on his desk. "Count the books, Joe." Joe counted the books. 1,000, 1,000,000, 3. 3, Miss Jules. "Correct," said Miss Jules. "May I go to recess now?" Joe asked. "No," said Miss Jules. "May I have a potato?" said Joe. "No, listen to me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Miss Jules. "Now you say it." 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, said Joe. "Very good," said Miss Jules. She put 6 erasers on his desk. "Now count the erasers, Joe, just the way I showed you." Joe counted the erasers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "There are 10, Miss Jules." "No," said Miss Jules. "Didn't I count it right?" asked Joe. "Yes, you counted right, but you got the wrong answer," said Miss Jules. "This doesn't make any sense," said Joe. "When I count the wrong way, I get the right answer. And when I count the right way, I get the wrong answer." Miss Jules hit her head against the wall 5 times. "How many times did I hit my head against the wall?" she asked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. "You hit your head against the wall 10 times, said Joe. "No," said Miss Jules. 4, 6, 1, 9, 5. "You hit your head 5 times, said Joe. Miss Jules shook her head no and said, "Yes, that is right." The bell rang, and all the other children came back from recess. The fresh air had made them very excited, and they were laughing and shouting. "Oh, darn," said Joe. "Now I missed recess." "Hey, Joe, where were you?" asked John. "You missed a great game of kickball." "I kicked a home run," said Todd. "What was wrong with you, Joe?" asked Joy. "Nothing," said Joe. "Miss Jules was just trying to teach me how to count." Joy laughed. "You mean you don't know how to count?" "Counting is easy," said Mauricia. Now, said Miss Jules. "What's easy for you may not be easy for Joe, and what's easy for Joe may not be easy for you." "Nothing's easy for Joe," said Mauricia. "He's stupid." "I can beat you up," said Joe. "Try it," said Mauricia. "That will be enough of that," said Miss Jules. She wrote Mauricia's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Joe put his head on his desk between the 8 potatoes and the 6 erasers. "Don't feel bad, Joe," said Miss Jules. I just don't get it, said Joe. I'll never learn how to count. Sure you will, Joe, said Miss Jules. One day it will just come to you. You'll wake up one morning and suddenly you'll be able to count. Joe asked, if all I have to do is wake up, what am I going to school for? School just speeds things up, said Miss Jules. Without school, it might take another 70 years before you wake up and you're able to count. By that time, I may have no hair left on the top of my head to count, said Joe. Exactly, said Miss Jules. That is why you go to school. When Joe woke up the next day, he knew how to count. He had 55,006 hairs on his head, and they were all curly.